Hey, welcome to the Breakaway Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the talks and stick around for more at the end.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, my wife was out of the country in India, and I was sick, trying to rest and recover at home. And so when I was laid out, I did what any self-respecting man would do if you were sick and trying to get better at home. I watched the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Saw it again. You know, if you watch it or read the books, all through it, there are people that are set up to be foils with one another, twin sides of the same coin, all through the entire narrative. And there's two in particular that I wanted to point out, the men. You have two men that are meant to be twin sides of the same coin. They're Aragorn and Boromir. And so as they're introduced, they're very similar. Both of them are representatives of mankind. Both of them are strong. Both of them are warriors. Both of them are part of the fellowship. And yet you see as their life progresses, they make very different decisions, right? And as they're faced with temptation, one folds, the other does not. And you see their lives go very different directions. So that by the end, one is a victorious king who rides out even to the very gates of the enemy, and he blesses the whole world, right? The other one bleeds out and dies alone in a forest. The last words on his lips being, "I failed." And it's interesting, in the movie, they try to redeem a little bit of Boromir. They gave him this speech at the end where he sees Aragorn and said, "I would have followed you to the gates of Mordor, my brother, my captain, my king," right? That's not in the book. In the book, his last words were, "Please protect the White City. I failed." And he dies filled with regret and failure. And he's a tragic hero. And my goal tonight, Lord help us, is to save you from that. Because the truth is, we get the same thing happening in these two texts of Scripture. We get two guys that are meant to be presented to us as foils, twin sides of the same coin. And as we see them show up, they're both sons of men. They're both within the fellowship of believers. And yet when it comes to decision, they start making very different decisions. And when you get to their destiny, they end up in very different directions. One will be a man who will bless his family and bless the whole world. Another man will be one who sees his family perverted and then watches everything he's built burn to the ground. And I want us to move away from that and in a totally different direction. Right? Now, again, the text is too long to cover, and so I want to just summarize some scenes. The way it plays out is the Lord's going to visit both men. And you see in 18, he's going to come to Abraham. And he will come to Abraham. Abraham will respond to him. They'll have a meal together, and they'll sit and commune together. And then God will issue him a command to trust him, to walk with him, to believe in what God's doing in his life. And then God will not just call Abraham to walk with him by faith. He will then move Abraham to this cliff. And in a very powerful scene, he will stand with God as they overlook a city. And God will say, "You want a window into how the world works?" He says, "I want you to be a man who raises a children who will walk in righteousness. So let me show you unrighteousness and how it's dealt with." And God tells him, "I'm going to destroy Sodom." And Abraham's scene closes with him being blessed by God. And now as he sees God ready to judge the wicked, Abraham begins to pray on their behalf. He becomes the defense attorney, begging for mercy for a wicked city. And then you see the representatives of God move to Lot. And they move to Lot, and he's going to look similar. And yet by the end of Lot, you see him, that his world is broken, his society's broken. And by the end of it, you see his entire city destroyed, and you see that his family has something desperately sick in it. But it's interesting, as we move through the text, the first place it starts is with their similarities. And you see it right away. God will come and visit both, and when he visits the two of them, they respond in similar ways. It says at the beginning of Genesis chapter 18, it says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre." And when he sees them, he sees three men. And these three men come up, and Abraham responds. He runs to them, he bows down, he calls them "my Lord," he calls himself "your servant," he offers to cook them a meal, he makes them a meal and gives them a place to rest. And you see when they come to Lot as he's sitting in Sodom, the same thing happens. These representatives of God come, and Lot runs to meet them, bows down, calls them Lord, himself his servant, offers to cook them a meal, brings them to his home, and cooks for them. And you see both of these guys, who the Bible will tell us both are believers, both are Christian men. And you see that they have a responsiveness to God that's very similar at the outset. And yet as the text progresses, suddenly things start to get very different. And it's interesting, as Abraham starts, two things leap out in the text, which is interesting to me that, number one, the Bible's pretty sparse with detail. It just is. And so when you see God come to Abraham, it's interesting. It says, "And the Lord appeared to him, and there were three men." And that's all it tells you. And I remember studying this text with my high school kids. There were tons of questions. What would that look like? What would he have been wearing? Does he look like a guy? And I said, the text doesn't tell us. It doesn't care. And yet the text will be profuse in a different set of detail. Not in what God looks like or what he was wearing, but in how Abraham responds when he sees him. And it's interesting, I don't know if you noted through the text, you see two things about Abraham's response to God right away. You see that as he moves towards God, you see a responsiveness that he runs. It says he runs to him and quickly prepares. And then he hurries to do this. And then quickly and then hurries. You see all along there's this responsiveness to God and Abraham that's immediate and it's extravagant. And you see in Lot, none of that is there. Actually, let me back up. There's a different point I wanted to make. The first difference I want to show you between these two guys, incidentally, to get out in time for Silver Taps, I had to take 8 pages of notes and condense it into 20 minutes, and we'll see how I do. But the first thing I want to show you is really the first difference is their location. With Abraham, the first thing it tells you is it says, now Abraham was by the oaks of Mamre when the Lord visits him. And so you see that Abraham, he's in the world. Mamre was a pagan. We met him a couple chapters before. And yet Abraham's living in a tent, and he has some separation from him. You see, Abraham mixes in with the culture, but he keeps a certain level of distance from those who have no interest in serving his God. He's in a tent by the oaks, and that's significant. When these angels, who we find out later they're angels, come to Lot, it says, now Lot was sitting in the gates of Sodom. And what's interesting about that is when you see Lot's life, Abraham and Lot arrived in Palestine together. And yet you see Lot, through Genesis 13, 14, and on, make a series of decisions. And the decisions he makes, number one, he sees over towards the direction of Sodom, there's land that looks lush and looks like it's prime and ready for him to make a profit. He sees success monetarily this way, and so he moves towards Sodom. And Genesis 13 says, and he moved his tents next to Sodom. Genesis 14 says, and he was living in Sodom. And now when we get to Genesis 19, it says, now he was sitting at the gates of the city. Now what's interesting about that is it's not like he was just sitting by himself at the gate of the city all alone. The gates of the city is where business was transacted. The gates of the city is where legal matters were handled, disputed, where business transactions were done. And so by saying that Lot was sitting at the gates of the city, what they were saying is Lot has completely enculturated. He has completely identified himself with the people of Sodom. And so the first thing you see about these guys, both believers, but they positioned themselves very differently. Abraham has walked with God, and by virtue of walking with God, there's some distance between him and the culture. Lot is a believer, but he just keeps kind of moving into his culture, closer into his culture, and more he's become more and more like the people of Sodom. And you see that not only is their location different, their associations are different. Something happens to these guys by virtue of this. And you see when the Lord comes to him, his responsiveness to him is ratcheted up. That's where we were going earlier. You said that he runs to God, he hurries to prepare, he quickly prepares, he runs. You see this immediacy. And you not just see immediacy, you see excellence. He picks the tender and choice calf. Meat was rare to eat back in those days. He picks the best. He picks curds and milk. That was the food of kings. He picks fine flour. That's the best kind you could get. And you see Abraham, though he's been an imperfect man, he's walking with God. And you see as he's become a man who walks with God, more and more he gets this immediate response to God and this extravagant response to God. He's a man who wants to know God and moves towards him. And what's interesting is as he does that, God responds to him. And God sits down and has a conversation with him. And he says, hey, where's Sarah, your wife? Now, God doesn't say that because he doesn't know where Sarah is. He's going to read Sarah's thoughts a little bit later. He just does that to get Sarah's attention. And so then he says to Abraham, hey, I just want to let you know, when I come back next year, your wife's going to have a child. And the text says that's a miracle because she's past the age of childbearing. Literally, it's biologically impossible for her to have a kid. And so Sarah laughs at that idea, and God calls her on it. He says, why are you laughing? You don't think I can pull that off? You don't think God's capable of that? And Sarah kind of panics and says, I didn't laugh. And God calls her on that too. He's like, no, I totally heard you. I'm God, and I pick up on stuff like that. And yet the text tells you she lies because she's afraid. It's not because she doesn't care about God and just lies to him. It's that there's this reverence. But it's interesting what you see happening there. You see in Abraham's relationship with God, he's gotten to a place where when God calls, when he hears the words of God, he responds immediately and he gives his best. And yet in doing that, it's not that he's just trying to placate God so God won't be mad at him and leave him alone. God speaks to him And God doesn't just offer a meal. God doesn't offer to pay for it. Will 20 cover it? God says, hey, you're blessing me, you're offering to me, but guess what? I'm going to give you a miracle baby, and you're going to change the whole world, okay? So it's never like I do God a favor and maybe he pays me back. It's that I serve the Lord and he blesses me abundantly, super abundantly. No one's a victim in the kingdom of God. No one outgives God and then we go, well, I guess I'm shortchanged, all right? God takes care of us. And then God calls them, do you believe me? He calls them to live by faith. And it's a struggle. They're imperfect in it. But there's this beautiful conversation with God that's honest and real. And it's a perfect picture from our Bible of what a man's supposed to be like. I remember for me, when I was a young Christian, I grew up going to church. I remember there were several moments in my young life where I thought real men didn't go to church. I thought true dudes didn't bother with all this because church services to me often just seemed real womanly. And so I was actually at a time in my life looking forward to the time where I got old enough to quit going to church. And it wasn't until, I don't know, junior high, something like that. We got a pastor at our church named Jim Klubnik, who was this wiry Russian man. And it wasn't that he was bulky, but he just looked tough. He looked like he was made of iron, right? I mean, he's the kind of guy that could just survive a rough Siberian winter and with nothing but his boxers, all right? You know, you're just like, that is a tough, like I would never mess with that guy, right? And I remember watching him stand up there and he would just have this gaunt, serious face and he would talk about the words of God and he would explain it. And you could see that when he did, he would warm up. He loved the words of God. And every now and again while he'd preach, he would preach a certain text and he'd go, we need to sing about that. Almighty, and we're like, and we would all start singing. And I had never heard a man like sing before. I just thought that was kind of weird too. Like I was like, wow, he's just singing to God. And he's talking about God. And he's not afraid to do that. I remember when I got into high school, I had a Bible study leader. And I thought he was a goofy guy, silly, laughed all the time. And I remember we all got to wrestling once, and he put us all on the mat. Turned out he was like a D1 wrestler, all right? I mean, he was vicious. I mean, he was like, I love God, and all right? And we'll just kind of put the hurt on you. And then I also noticed that he was fearless. He loved the Lord, and he would take us into bars in the 3rd Ward and just open the doors and be like, hey, everybody, I need to tell you about Jesus. Calm down, all right? Put that gun away. Open up your Bibles, if you got one, to Genesis. All right, and he was unafraid socially. And I remember seeing these guys and looking at their lives and watching their lives, and what marked them was they were very responsive to the Lord. They loved God. They offered God their lives. God dealt honestly with them, and then God used them to bless the world. And I remember that changed me. And I remember it really was in college that a big shift happened in me. Okay, I'm not just going to do a little bit of religion while I chase my world. I'm actually going to consider walking with God. Really believing what he says, really trying to obey, really actually taking these words seriously. And then I found out that it was an honest dialogue. It was, God, I don't know if I believe that. And God saying, well, will you trust me? Well, I guess I'll try. And it was this honest dialogue where I grew. And that's exactly where you see Abraham. He's walking with God. He's responsive to God. And God talks to him and grows his faith. And it's beautiful. Lot, on the other hand, he's a believer. He's a Christian. 2 Peter will tell us that. We know he's a believer. And yet for him, he's not out in the wilderness communing with God. He's not. He's in the city of Sodom. And what's interesting about it is he calls these people into his home. And you see, initially, he looks like Abraham. And so he's saying, let me cook you a meal. Let's do this. But then he says, come to my house, have dinner, then rise early and go on your way. And so it starts to sound different right away. It's like, why does he want them to come in, eat dinner, and then get up early and leave? Like, is he trying to hurry them along? And then they say, no, we'll stay in the town square. And it says, then he urged them strongly, and they came to his home. And you go, what's the deal with that? And you find out the deal later, because where Abraham's place was hospitable to God and welcoming to God, where Lot lives, he's completely enculturated in Sodom. He gets a knock on the door, and it's the whole city. And they said, hey, you got some guys in there with you? Yeah, will you bring them out? Because we want to rape them, right? That's the idea. And you see, he's in a pretty messed up place. Somebody asked me, hey, what's the message about tonight? Where are you going tonight? And I said, never try to rape an angel. God will make you blind and burn your house down. That's tonight's message. That's not actually the point I want to make, but you see Lot in a city where they come to him and they tell him, hey, bring these guys out. We want to do whatever we want. And you see he's part of a culture that, listen to this, if you're in a culture that abandons God, what happens? If I have no moral standard to hold myself to, what do I hold myself to? Whatever I feel like. And so I don't have a universal standard to obey. What do I have to obey? Preference. And the more you do that, just give it time, and you become a hedonist. I just do whatever I want that makes me feel good. And then Sodom has devolved into the worst state. Sex is not about love, not about intimacy, not about caring. It's about complete using people for my gratification. They are seriously broken. And you see, Lot, as a believer, has enculturated himself with them. He says, I'm a Christian, but when it comes to where I live, he makes his closest associations Sodomites. People who aren't chasing the words of God. People who don't care about the things of God. People who aren't responsive to God. His closest buddies are people who are dark. What he's chasing after are things that lie in some dark places. That's where Lot lives. And yet it's interesting. You see some of his faith show up. He shuts the door behind him. And it's interesting. I think he does it to try to keep the angels out of the conversation. He shuts the door and he comes out and he addresses the Sodomites as brothers. He's trying to continue his connection with them. And he says, hey, brothers, don't do this. And so you see he has a sense of morality. He says, don't act wickedly. There's something wicked about what you're doing. But then he offers a solution, which if you caught it earlier, is pretty jacked up. He says, guys, don't do this. Hey, I've got some daughters. Why don't you just have it them? And so you read that, and up until this point, Lot sounded okay. He sounded a lot like Abraham. He's looking okay, and then you go, whoa! I think he just sold out his daughters. What's up with that? And you see what 1 Corinthians 15 says. Don't be deceived. Bad company spoils good character. And you see the more Abraham walks with God, the more responsive to God he becomes, the more faithful he becomes, the more alive he becomes as a man. You see Lot, the more he hangs out with Sodom, he retains some Christian morality, and yet it's gotten twisted. It's gotten broken. And I got to tell you something. I saw this all the time when I was in college. You pretty much got two kinds of Christians that I knew in college. Guys that said, hey, I'm broken, and they got all kinds of issues in their own life with sexual sin or arrogance or pride or legalism or whatever. But at the end of the day, their basic trajectory is, I want to be responsive to God. And then you got another set of guys that say, I want to hold on to my Christian morality, but then when it comes to my life, I want to do whatever I want. And I'm just going to go where I want, and it'll be fine. And these guys, they always start to twist a little bit. And you see Lot, he's a believer. He's the righteous Lot. But he ain't looking so good. And I gotta tell you, I've got buddies like this, and I've had buddies like this all through college, where slowly over time, when it comes to the decisions in their life, they begin to ebb and flow and move further away and make compromises about what they let their eyes see, hands touch, where they'll go relationally, what they'll do with their bodies, what they chase with their time. You see them begin to drift away, and there's something very broken about Lot. And at the bottom of it, what you really see is it's a love issue. It's a love issue. It's interesting. God will have this conversation with Abraham, and they have this honest interaction about living by faith. And then at the end of the meal, God stands up, and Abraham walks God to the door, essentially, except there's no door. They're out in the wilderness, and so he just walks him out to say goodbye. And as they get out there, God has this interesting relationship. He walks up, and he's with the other two guys, and he goes, should I tell Abraham what I'm about to do? Which you never say something like that out loud unless you're planning on telling someone something, right? I mean, you never say, should I tell you about that thing? No, forget it. You don't do that. You say that so they'll go, yes, tell me. And you go, okay, all right. So if you say it out loud, you're planning on saying it, right? So God's external processing with Abraham, all right? Why? Because he wants to tell him. He says, should I tell Abraham what I'm about to do? And he says, yeah, I should. You know why? He said, because I've chosen him. Literally, he says, because I've known him. Because we know each other. And because he's someone who I am building up to raise a generation who will walk in the paths of God. He is a man who loves me and a man who knows me. He's going to raise up a generation that he will influence in my name. So yeah, let me show you something. And then he points down towards Sodom. And as these two angels begin to make their way down there, God says there's an outcry there. An outcry means that there are people oppressed and they're screaming for relief. And God says there's an outcry. And so I'm going to go see it. And if it's as bad as I think it is, I'm going to destroy it. Now, did God need to come down to the earth to see it? No, but he was creating this moment where he's teaching his son Abraham. He says, Abraham knows me, and I know him. Let's have a conversation about this. Abraham, I'm about to destroy the wicked. What do you think about that? And what's interesting is it says Abraham was standing before the Lord, and then the next verse says, and then Abraham came near to the Lord. And you go, what does that mean? He was already standing there. It's literally a judicial term. It's like Abraham approaches the bench. God puts Abraham in this position where Abraham has been a recipient of the grace of God. I'm going to bless you and bless the whole world. And then God stands them there and says, hey, these people are going to be recipients not of my grace, but my judgment. And then he waits to see what Abraham will do. And Abraham responds rightly. He steps forward and says, oh God, will you spare them? And what's interesting is, he starts in this whole conversation is, will you spare the city if there's 50 of them? What's interesting about his argument with God that will go on far in the text, he doesn't say, oh God, please spare the righteous and then burn those other mothers down. He doesn't say that. He says, God, if there's 50 righteous people in the city, will you save the whole city? And God says, yeah, I'll do that. And he says, what if there's 40 guys? If there's 40 righteous people, will you save the unrighteous too? Yeah, I'll do that. And they just kind of keep rocking it down until he gets to 10 people. If there's 10 righteous people, will you save everybody? And what's interesting about that is Abraham and the Sodomites aren't friends. Earlier, when Sodom offered a relationship with Abram where they would bind themselves together monetarily, Abraham said, I don't want anything to do with what you guys are about. No thanks. And yet here he is, and when he sees the judgment of God falling on them, he isn't saying, serves you right, that's what you get. It says he looks at them, and here's a man who has known the grace of God, enjoyed the grace of God. And now when he sees people facing the wrath of God, he becomes an agent of mercy. And he intercedes on their behalf and begs God to save not just the holy, but the unholy. Oh God, please rescue them. And you see, Abraham loves the world in the right way. It's interesting, in the Gospel of John, John 3:16, it says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And yet in 1 John, same guy writes, says, don't love the world or anything in the world. And you go, so which is it? Should I love the world or not love the world? And you see, there's two different worlds it's talking about. In John 3:16, it's talking about the world, it's talking about people. You should love people. God sent his son Jesus because he loves people. And you see Abraham, he stands and he loves the world in the right way. He's begging God to rescue those who are oppressed. And you see Lot loves the world in the wrong way, in the 1 John kind of way. Because when Lot comes and this horrible scene happens where they want to have their way with these men, he tells them not to. What's interesting is he calls them brothers, and you notice they call him alien. They were fine with with Lot mixing in with them until he inserted a morality that's outside their sphere. You ever done that before? The world is wonderfully tolerant of what is tolerant of them. But you watch, you hanging out with buddies that don't love your God, but you hang out with them because they're cool and you've been friends and you can't imagine not doing them. You try to exert an external morality and see what happens. They say, you alien, how dare you act like a judge? And they accuse you of wickedness. And so they look at Lot and say, what you're doing is wicked. We're going to treat you worse. And so they threaten to kill Lot. And so these angels rescue Lot, pull him in the house. And do you remember they say, hey, Lot, go get your relatives because we're burning this city down. He goes and gets his sons-in-laws. And he tells them, hey, God's going to destroy the city. And what happens? They laugh at him. He has no moral authority at all. All right? He's never exerted any allegiance to God that they've seen. And so now that he's talking about religion, they think it's a joke. And yet when the moment comes for them to destroy the city, you get this amazing scene in verses 16 and following. It says they grab him and they say, Lot, get up, take your wife, your 2 daughters who are with you, or you'll be swept away in the punishment of the city. And then verse 16 says, but he hesitated. God says, hey, I'm going to destroy the whole city. Get out. And Lot doesn't move. And so it says the angel seized him by the hand, seized his daughters by the hand, seized his wife by the hand, and pull him out of the city. And they say, escape to the mountains. And his response is, oh no. Like, what do you mean, no? They're going to burn the place down. And he says, no, thank you for saving me, but if I go to the mountains, I'll die, which doesn't even make sense. You're like, you think God saved you so that he could kill you? What are you talking about, Lot? But then he moves on and says, I can't run to the mountains. Let me go to Zoar. It's a little city. Look how little it is. Can I go there? Because it's small and it's a little city and it's small. And he kind of keeps going on and on. It's meant to build tension that they're in this moment where everything's about to burn. And he keeps having this conversation. Can I go to the city? Because it's little. Do you see the city? It's little, but it's nice, but it's little. And you're like, shut up. The city's burning down. All right. And you're like, why are you doing this? And you see Lot is addicted. He's addicted. He loves this world. He loves it a lot. Not in a holy Abraham way of I want to see you know my God and enjoy him, but in a I want to derive my sense of satisfaction from this world. And so the idea of losing Sodom, or even a little bit of Sodom, it's just more than he can handle. Which I would challenge you guys. I don't know if you could think about tonight, what's the thing God could take from you that would devastate you? I mean, some people, we want to follow God. Yeah, I'll be a good Christian, but we make guarantees. I'll make a good Christian, but God, I'm here to make some money, all right? I'll be a good Christian millionaire. You got that? Write that down. They say, God, I'm going to love you and whatever, serve you and go to church and all that, but I'm going to date whoever I want. I'm going to party wherever I want. It's my body. I'll do whatever I want with my body, right? What would God take from you that you would completely resist? You'd think your life would be ruined if he took away that girl, took away those people, took away that acceptance, took away that trajectory. Is there something God could take from you and it would ruin your life? You be careful. You be careful, because you're looking a lot like Lot. And so they run Lot to the end of the city, and they get him out of there. But it's a love issue. And in the end, in the conclusion, and we'll wrap this up, you see two very different kinds of lives. Lot is going to lose everything. And here's where I really want to go with Lot. This is what stood out to me so powerfully. Lot became a man. He went to Sodom for the money. And he went there, and they were sexually perverted, but it didn't bother him. But he went there for the money and the power and the influence. And those are the things men are constantly seeking. Money, sex, and power is what men chase. And we do it, I see so many guys do it with just a little bit of God splashed in. But here's what's going to happen to Lot. They run out of the city, and what happens? His wife turns around, and it says she becomes a pillar of salt. You remember that? Which isn't random. It's not like God just picked some random thing. I'll make her salt. Like he was going to go, well, I was thinking ham sandwich, but I went with salt. All right? It's not random. Sodom and Gomorrah, we find out in Genesis, was a lush place. By the end of it, it's dead. No agriculture, no animals, no anything. God completely burns it down, and it's still that way today. It's just a salt waste. And you see, it's like Pompeii. You can still go there today. Remember when the volcano erupted and smashed over the city with all that ash? There are people, I went and saw their bodies. They're completely entombed in ash. You can see them with their mouths still open. You can see their teeth. You can see their jewelry. And you see that his wife, when it came time to run, she just couldn't let go. And it killed her. And then the text ends in this really weird way. You see, he ends up running to the mountains. And you see his daughters go with him. And whatever happened was cataclysmic geologically. So much so that his daughters thought it was the end of the world. And they say, our dad's the only man left. And so the passage ends with his two daughters getting him drunk and having sex with him. And showing you that two nations that the Israelites would know later, the Moabites and Ammonites, came from this incestuous relationship. And they are, the Moabites and Ammonites, wicked and perverse people. And that's how the chapter ends. And what's it trying to show you? It's trying to show you that if you're a man like Lot, you can be saved by God. You can be rescued by God from judgment as through the flames. You can. Can you be a Christian and live an unproductive life for God and still be saved? Yeah, at some degree, Lot gets there. And yet, when you look at his life, what happens? Everything he built burns to the ground. And worse than that, he dooms his wife and daughters. And I'll be honest with you, what's burdened me about this text, and as I thought about you guys, was this. Often when we men pursue our glory and our power and our money and those things, you know who goes to hell? The women around us. The women around us. It's interesting. The World Health Organization says 1 out of every 5 females in the world are physically and or sexually abused by men at some point in their lives. U.S. Surgeon General says domestic violence, that is a family member, some male in the home, domestic violence by males against females accounts for more adult female emergency room visits than traffic accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. U.S. Department of Justice says 30% of women who are killed by their husbands, ex-husbands, boyfriends. I started reading the local news. You know how many times I see domestic violence, a man beating a woman in our town? Once a week. About once a week. That's the ones that make the news. And some of you go, I'm never going to beat my wife or rape women or anything like that. United Nations says 4 million women and girls are trafficked annually. UNICEF says 1 million children, mostly girls, enter the sex trade every year. 21.2 million children in the U.S. are raised by single parents, 84% of those being women. What happens? One of two things. Either we violently oppress women, or we don't do anything. And you look around in our world, and the internet is filled with pornography. The world is filled with the outcry of women. Think about that. 1 out of every 5. And I got to be honest with you, I'm at an age now where I'm starting to learn more and more about people I care deeply. These statistics are true of people I know. It's not just off somewhere else in the world. But you count 1, 2, 3, 4 abused, abused, abused. And here's one thing. Either some of us in this room are the abusers, or some of us in this room are so busy chasing our money, our power, our glory, that while that's going on, we don't do anything. We're like Lot. We don't do anything. And it's the daughters and it's the moms that go to hell. And I just think, that's got to change, man. And the beautiful thing is, it doesn't have to be like that. And you see Abraham, the passage ends, it's fascinating, it would make a great shot in a movie. As the city's burning, you see Lot escaping into this little cave, but the camera pans up and you see Abraham standing on a hill. And it says that Lot and his daughters were saved because of Abraham. That at the end of it, you see a man standing triumphantly on a hill, and it's because of his relationship with God and because he cried out to God that there are people who can be rescued out of the darkness. And that's the kind of man I want you to be. A man who knows God, loves God, communes with God, deals honestly with God, and then steps out into a broken world and from a position of grace, steps out to love people. So my wife went to India to work with a ministry called Care Asia. The whole purpose of this ministry is to save girls from sex trafficking. There's an enormous prostitution organizations reality in India, and she went to go be a part of a ministry that's trying to stop it. She went and visited brothels where moms are servicing 40 men a day, and the babies they have, they just keep in a little basket underneath the bed. And little girls enter into the industry at about 4. They're sold in duffel bags. And there's this guy, Ralph. Ralph was raised by a mom who was an orphan, got married, his dad died, and so his mom was an orphan and a widow. And yet she got a job as a nurse at a Christian school. Ralph got to hear about the grace of Jesus Christ. He got older, got a good education at the school, so he moved to the States, got a good degree, and started chasing success. Got a good job, telecommunications, started making money, started climbing the ladder. But as he did it, he was reading his Bible and just thinking about the things of God, but he was making that money, but the things of God. And finally a moment came where he says, you know what? I need to live a different kind of life. And I can't just chase my money, my power, my glory while the whole world is in an outcry. And so he moved back to India, and he started a ministry that rescues girls out of the dark. He started in 2007. 50 girls are out, and he's continuing to move. And I said, that's the kind of men we're called to be. Now, I'm not saying vocational ministry, but I'm saying you're going to break into a Lot camp where maybe you're not perpetrating the evil, but as you sit in the midst of it, you don't do anything to impact it or make a difference. Or you're going to be someone who pursues the things of God. And as you do that and deal honestly with him and respond to him, he is going to use you to change the world. And that's the kind of man I want you to be. How are you going to get there? Real quickly. It says that Lot was saved because the compassion of the Lord is on him. How are you going to get out of some of the dark things you're in? The compassion of God. Not by your own power, the compassion of God. What do you do after that? It says that God called Abraham to walk in the ways of God. It's interesting that it doesn't just say obey the commands. It says walk in the ways. That as I walk with God, it's a trajectory with a destiny. That my life now becomes a moment-by-moment communion with God. That I'm rescued from sin by his compassion, and that I walk with him step by step in communion. And then God uses me to change the world. And last, you go, where do I get the power to do that? It's interesting. Jesus Christ, in Matthew chapter 11, is talking to the city of Capernaum, producing woes on them. He says, you guys are going to be destroyed. And then he says to them, if the miracles that I've been doing had occurred in Sodom, they would remain to this day. Jesus says, if the Sodomites could have seen me, they would have totally changed. And so if you go, Ben, I have thrown away years of my life, I'm a mess. Jesus says, if the Sodomites could have just seen Jesus, he could have radically changed their lives. How are you going to make a difference? Not by making God promises, not by promising to be better. You look to the person of Jesus Christ, who will rescue you by the compassion of God and will lead you in a path where you can make a difference. That's a Christian life. And that's my hope for you guys. That we wouldn't play in two worlds. We would run in one path because he set us free.
Welcome to this part of the podcast. We're so glad you're with us today. And Ben, we had our all men's breakaway last night.
Yes, we did.
And it was really fun. And the guys showed up in full force at Grace Bible, ready to go, pretty jazzed up about the night.
It was awesome.
We packed it out and just had a really cool time.
It was just fun to see, and they weren't just kind of sitting there looking around. I mean, they were really worshiping and really engaged in teaching. Like, they were just fully engaged. Like, there was an energy there too. And it was stunning how bad it smelled,
Whoa.
because I was there in that same building this weekend when we had the Masterpiece Conference for Girls. And when I walked in, it's like a stereotypical joke. Guys are smelling. I got on stage and was like, wow. Yeah, this is...
It was almost as bad as a junior high locker room.
That's what it smelled like.
Yeah. Like boys who've never been told you need to put on deodorant. You know what I'm saying? It was bad. But what do you expect? I mean, you get over... Actually, we had 777 guys.
That's what I'm saying. It's a lot of people,
Yeah.
a lot of odors colliding. But they thought it was funny. So did I. It was good times. Good times for the people.
Yeah.
And we loved it, man. It was a great night.
Mm-hmm. It was solid. And, you guys just heard the podcast, but Ben, I know it was a super hard challenge, just kind of taking two really full-packed chapters, in Genesis, and trying to kind of tell this really epic kind of story of two lives that went in different directions, like you were sharing. And so, we were just sitting here before we started recording this, and you were like, "Yeah, I'm looking at 8 pages of notes or something, and I didn't even do this." No. You didn't even really follow, because it was a challenge to do a 20-30 minute kind of synopsis of a lot of really great teachable truth for us.
Yeah.
And so maybe, I don't know, is there stuff that you were like, I really would love to kind of share a little more, or even just, hey, this is something that after I went home last night, I was thinking, oh, these guys need to know this,
Yeah. Well, it was tough. It was Silver Taps night, and so you want to give space for that. But yeah, it was a collision of probably the longest talk I'd ever written and the shortest amount of time I had to give it this semester. So perfect storm. But I think we got the gist of it across. I would say, one text I wanted to read is Ezekiel 16. So inevitably when you bring up Sodom, people go, okay, did God destroy them because they're homosexual? That's a, popular refrain. And you get in Ezekiel 16:49, it says quite directly, now this is the sin of your sister Sodom. Then it tells you. It says, she and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. That was their problem. They were arrogant people, and they were hedonistic, overfed. They had filled all their desires, and so they were unconcerned. And it says they did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them. And so he says their essential problem was they were just living for themselves. They were living for their own satisfaction, their own comfort, their own whatever. And then when you live like that long enough, when you say, I'm not concerned about God or his things, the more you distance from God, the more you distance from caring about people, and the more it just becomes about you and your stuff, and you continue on that, and it slides. And then you get to where Sodom did, where it had slid to its lowest point, where he says what they did was detestable. And so the Bible does condemn homosexual practice, certainly condemns rape, and it shows you in this text these people had gone to a place where there was zero concern for people. And that was the issue. To do that shows zero concern for the community. And God has a problem with that. He has a problem with us not caring about the poor and the needy. And so I say that because, some people hear that and they go, well, see, I don't struggle with that. And you go, yeah, but you could be feeding into that system even now. And that was a big thrust of the talk, is just saying, if you've said, yeah, I'm a Christian, check, but I'm just going to chase whatever I want. I'm making my money to buy my house, to get my furniture and my TV so I can be comfortable, and I'll do what I want and whatever. You go, okay, do you see that you're on the same path? You may not be as far down, but you're on that road of being arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. And God has a problem with that. The closer you get to God, the more you see his great passion and love for people. And so we talked a lot about that with Lot, because Lot had sought his own pursuits away from God into this city. The more he had sort of soaked in that environment, the more it had perverted him. And he was still a Christian, and he wasn't as perverted as the Sodomites, but he was living there. He was permissive of it. He was okay with it at some level. And what you saw happen was he ends up with his wife dead and his daughters perverted. And so the point I was making was, if we as men, and particularly Christian men, if we don't take a hard stance of, I'm pursuing God. And I love that God tells Abraham, you're going to teach your children to keep the way of the Lord, not just the commandments, but you walk with me. It's a pursuit and a trajectory. If we're not on that trajectory, then we become part of the problem, either actively in the oppression of women or passively as we sit around and do nothing. And I just think it's a travesty if Christian men, all we do with 24 hours a day is pursue our own pleasure and comfort while the world burns. I mean, I think God has a serious problem with that. And you look at any statistic anywhere and you see the world's on fire. I mean, there are girls suffering all over. And that's the point I really wanted to point out in here is you see Lot's daughters get perverted and his wife's dead. And you go, when men sin, women suffer. You see that all through human history. When men sin, either actively or just passively put up with it, it's the women who suffer. And go online and you see that. The women and the children, his kids suffer. What's our internet filled with? The exploitation of women and children. For what? For men's sexual gratification. That's what it is. It's rampant in the U.S. It's rampant in the world. And if Christian men go, well, that's just awful. I would never do that. But meanwhile, I'm not going to do anything. You're being Lotish. I mean, you're part of the problem at that point. And I just don't want these men to do that because, like you were saying earlier, Jeremy, it's not going to start there. You don't start with going, you know what, I'm going to be completely indifferent to the concerns around me. You don't start there. You just start like Lot did. You just inch a little closer. And then you go, this tent's inconvenient. I'm going to go ahead and move into a house, rent an apartment here, and you end up at the city gate. And you start living a lifestyle where just slowly you compromise till later in life, you're still a Christian. That's not the debate. But your life is completely ineffective for honoring God and helping people. And that's awful.
Definitely. Well, with the generation that we have an opportunity to pour into here right now, and we're praying that God would raise up a generation of men and women who would live for him and his glory and his purposes. But what happens is, I think most of the guys that were sitting there last night probably have a tension with their father or like their family that they look at and they go, but that's kind of what I've grown up around, or that's what I know, is kind of this pursuit of job and status and car and, kind of keeping things in order and in check and just kind of moving through life without a Godward trajectory. But it doesn't mean that there's godlessness going on necessarily. It just means that guys aren't looking toward the purposes of God for their life. So how would a student walking away last night who's going, I don't really have that modeled for me. Actually, it's a tension for me and my family because my parents are driving me to do certain things that I just don't really have a desire to do now that I'm like trying to serve the Lord. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, I think it's really, Jesus said it when these guys came to him and said, hey, we've got some family disputes about our money. And Jesus was just like, wait, pause. I'm not concerned with that. He says, who made me an arbiter between you? And then he tells the story of greed about a guy who just sought money and said, I'll store up all my wealth and I'll be comfortable. And God says, you're a fool because you weren't rich towards God. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and says, seek first the kingdom and do not worry about what you will eat or what you will drink or what you'll wear. Your Father in heaven knows you need these things, right? And so he tells them, your pursuit in life should be of me. And as you do that, I will meet your needs. Now, that unloads a million pragmatic questions, especially like you said at this crossroads where you go, does that mean I don't get a job? Do I just wander? Do I become St. Francis, wander naked in the woods and God will feed me? Like, what does this mean? And you go, no, I'm going to pursue God as much as I know what that means. I'm going to look into the words of God and read his word, because when I know God, I'll love God. And the more I know him and love him, the more I'll think like him, the more his concerns become mine, his pursuits become mine. And yes, I will use my gifts to do something. You know, Paul mended tents. Jesus was a carpenter. These guys did tasks. You can do these. You know, God commends work. And so you do work with your hand. You use the gifts God gave you to work, and you do get money, and you do take care of your family. That stuff happens, but it's all while you're on this totally different trajectory. And so it's whenever you make those things the ultimate things, your pursuit, that I think you start getting off track. And so that's the battle in the heart I think these young men are going to have to face. It's just that, how do I take these things in my life and not make them idols? Not take functional things like money and clothes and food and make them ultimate things like I have to have that quality of food or that quality of clothes or that quality of house. You go, okay, you've derailed. You've made it a trajectory, and it was not meant to be. A house is meant to be a place you sleep. You know? And I'm not saying live in a dump, but I'm just saying you don't have to. If you're making that your pursuit, you're already off.
Yeah.
You know? And so anyway, you're right. There's so many cool guys there, and I didn't want them to leave and going, so Ben thinks you're all perverts and ruining your life, and all the problems in women's lives are your fault. That's not what I was saying, but I'm just saying we have to wake up and see this. And I just hate the way our culture markets to men your grown children who just sit and drool and seek what makes you feel good. You go, that's not a man. And the Bible's interested in men and raising men. And so I think the keys, and we just touched on them, were, with Lot, he got rescued. He made it out, and you can make it out. And it says explicitly in verse 16, it says, for the compassion of the Lord was on him. I mean, when you get broken by your sin, and there was some guys broken last night, I'm just going, okay, I had guys come tell me, hey, I am Lot, and I don't know what to do. I said, the first thing you do is just rest in the compassion of the Lord. Don't make a bunch of promises. God, I swear I'll. You just go, God, you have to save. Seize me by the hand and pull me out, whatever that looks like. And for some people, it'll mean distancing from certain relationships. From some people, that's not the first thing they need to do. The first thing they need to do is start building some healthier ones. Go to a church, get in a small group, start to read the words of God with the people of God, develop a heart of God, and that sort of thing. Walk in the way of the Lord. I think you just go, okay, I'm gonna take God seriously and prioritize him in a way that is new for me. And it's going to be dynamic and real. That's what I love about Abraham's situation. It's not like, and Abraham's offering incense and quoting certain things. He's sitting at a meal and having a conversation with God. And God says, here's some miraculous things I want to do. And they start laughing. They're like, hey, yeah, that's kind of crazy. And God's like, no, actually, I really want you to. And you see, it's this given, it's dynamic, it's relational. And you go, that's what he's calling us to. So that's what I would just engage God. And does that feel nebulous and scary? Yeah, but that's life and that's relationships. And I just think when you do that, you'll look up and go, okay, I'm on a journey. And the same compassion that rescued me, God begins to build in your heart. And you'll be an Abram standing on a cliff looking at the city and going, God, will you show compassion on them too? You did it to me, will you do it to them? And then you become part of the solution.
Well, the challenge last night was for every guy in the room. It wasn't just for a certain group of guys.
Yeah.
Because you could be either Abraham or Lot. You could be an Abraham that's going, God, I need to be praying for my friends in this campus and this generation. So that's our hope, is that the guys would leave last night and realize that there is something that everyone needs to be doing.
Yeah.
We can all take steps toward really living out the gospel and living out just the good news of Jesus Christ. So that's really encouraging and just uplifting, and it was a really, really good night. So thanks for taking on the challenge of, raising a red flag for us. I think God is a father who disciplines his children. He's a good father, and what you did for us last night was display some of that fatherly discipline, going, hey, we could talk about some other stuff, but this is important, and so let's not like kind of graze over it, but let's think about it and stop and ponder and give God a moment to grow us up, mature us.
Well, and I would say, thank you. And I would say one last thing. When you see God in the Bible, if you had to distill down what God's like, you would say holy and loving, that there's this purity and there's a compassion for people. And when you see someone become godly, that's what's manifest in them. There's a purity. I don't want darkness in my life. I don't want to lie. I don't want to be deceptive. I don't want to use people. I want a distance from impurity. I want to be pure. But some people can stress that and go, so I'm going to get away from all you sinners and rain down the brimstone, God, just as long as I'm out of the city. You go, no. When you're walking with God, there's always purity and love. I'm going to separate myself, but I'm going to care deeply for people, even the sinner, and especially the sinner, and be like Abraham and pray for him. So you're right. And I talked to some guys afterwards that they really stressed the purity, but I got to get away from all these people. And you go, you may need to change some of your relationships, but walking with Christ is this balance of holiness and love. I separate, but also draw near. It's a bit, it's a miracle, something God does. But that's what we want to be, men who are pure, have integrity and character, and then deeply care about people.
Cool. Well, we're really looking forward to next week too, because we had all women's 2 weeks ago, then we had all men's last night, and now we all get to kind of join back, bring the forces together,
Bring the kids together,
and hold hands and sing and read or something. I don't know, but we'll be in Reed Arena, and this is actually our breakaway before we take a break for spring break.
Yeah.
So we'll do one more and read and then take a break. Everybody kind of make notes that we won't be around the week of, March 15th through the 19th or something. So the office will kind of be quiet and locked up, and students will be scattered abroad. But we're praying for people as they take off for break. But hopefully, you guys can join us next week at Reed Arena at 9:00. And then there's something really, really cool that we've kind of saved toward the very end of this podcast. So if you've made it this far, way to go, because here's a little, carrot at the end of the stick. But we've got some friends of ours who, we mentioned before the Passion conferences that we went to in January, and they recorded a live record there that's just some amazing songs, new, beautiful worship that is very encouraging and just really good worship. And I don't know how to say it any better than it's just really good.
Yeah.
And so they have offered us a chance to sell the new release at Breakaway next week. So if you guys are planning on coming, you can get that. I think it's a discounted price. We're going to sell it for $10, which is a very cool discount that we're going to be able to offer people. So make sure you come, and if you want to get some new worship kind of stuff to listen to in your car or at home, be encouraged, because we're going to offer you some on Tuesday night. So do you want to add anything to it?
Well, it's been great. We've already started leading some of them at Breakaway, and they're just, like you said, phenomenal songs. So it's nice to be able to offer them, and like you said, do it in a discounted way for our students. It's pretty cool too. So,
well, good.
Yeah,
so,
I'm looking forward to it.
Get excited, everybody, and we will. We're going to wrap up and say thanks again for being here, and look forward to seeing everybody at Reed next week, and being on the podcast with you next week. So, thanks.
See you.